Hi, folks. My name is Girish, the host for Back to Basics, another Back to Basics for another week. We are going to be talking about Bitcoin. Oh, God, another Bitcoin. Oh, God, why Bitcoin? Well, this is the why. This person, he has written a book, several books, actually 2 books, and then we'll talk about the details of that. And then we'll get to the details as to why Bitcoin is so important and why I'm talking about it over and over again, but in a different way. We want to educate people that Bitcoin is here to stay, but how do we manage that? And that's why Jimmy's here to help us out, to educate us in many different ways, in a basic way, in a fun way. Jimmy, how are you? And thanks for coming to Back to Basics.
Well, thanks for having me. And yeah, excited to explain whatever it is that you want explained on the show.
Thank you so much. So before we get into the basics of your book and all the educated stuff of Bitcoin and crypto and everything else, what does Back to Basic mean to you?
Well, it means going back to first principles, at least. That's what I would say are the basics, and then deriving sort of consequential things from the first principles that you start off from.
Yeah. Thank you again, by the way, Jimmy, for doing this. So before we get into the details of the Bitcoin, what makes you a educator in Bitcoin, and what makes you become an author in Bitcoin? So I guess it's a short question.
Yeah, sure. So I started as a programmer. I've been a programmer all my life, and I've been working as a professional programmer since I got out of college, which was 23 years ago. So I've been a software programmer for a long time, and I encountered Bitcoin back in 2011 when it was barely 2 years old. When I read about it, I learned about it, and I started programming in it a couple of years later. And I've programmed Bitcoin related things for a very long time, 8 years, 9 years now. So I have that programming background, but I'm also, libertarian politically. So back in 2008, when the great financial crisis was happening, I started learning about the economics of everything. So based on those two different aspects of my life, I think I got to understand Bitcoin fairly early and understand it at a deep level. So as you mentioned, I've written several books. One of them is Programming Bitcoin, and that's published with O'Reilly. And that is a book that they're the premier tech publisher in the United States. And I was privileged to be able to publish a book with them. But I've also written 3 other books in conjunction with other people, and more for the layperson and not programmers. And these are the Little Bitcoin book, Thank God for Bitcoin, and the newest one, which I wrote maybe like a month and a half ago. It's called Bitcoin and the American Dream. So they're all different sort of aspects of Bitcoin. I'm trying to show that it's not what you think it is. For most people, they have a tendency to think that Bitcoin is this, like money for nerds or for people on the dark net or something like that. And of course, there is a part of that, but it's way more than that. And there's a lot of people that are using Bitcoin for all sorts of things, mostly around money. And that's what I'm here to explain to you today.
Yeah. Thank you again, Jimmy, to explain that to me and our listeners here. Now you just mentioned that 2008. Is that when the Bitcoin kind of started? Because the reason why I'm saying that is because nowadays we're all talking about Bitcoin and crypto and everything else, right? And it seems like that it's kind of a trend or a fad. But is it a fad or is it here to stay? And when did it all start?
Yeah, so it all started back in 2008, but like you can go even further back than that, all the way back to somewhere around 1993 or even like 1977 or what have you. And I'll go start at start way back in the 70s when Wilfred Diffie and Martin Hellman created a mathematical protocol for secure cryptography. Essentially, they developed something called asymmetric cryptography, or what we would call today public key cryptography. It's this idea that you can lock you can prove that you know a secret without actually revealing the secret, which seems kind of like magic, and it still does to me. And I was a math major back in college, and that started off a whole bunch of sort of attempts at creating some sort of a digital cash. There was a guy named David Chom who made a form of digital cash in a paper theoretically in 1981. By 1995, he had set up a company, DigiCash, that was supposed to be sort of like an anonymous payment protocol on the internet. Unfortunately, credit cards took hold, and it turns out people didn't really care that much about privacy. They would rather just like enter their credit card number online, and that was fine. So that was one aspect of it. But 1993 was when there was a Cypherpunk email list. And this was a bunch of liberty-minded technologists that were trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that all of this new technology that's available, particularly around the internet, is used for good and not for evil? And basically, they wanted a radical self-sovereignty. And if you read the Cypherpunk Manifesto, which was written in 1993, you can see in there one of the main points is we need a secure digital cash. And that was sort of like the beginning of many different attempts at trying to come up with digital cash. So there was a paper by Wei Dai in 1998 called B Money. There were several other things with Hal Finney and Adam Back and so on. But it really wasn't until around 2007, 2008, when an anonymous developer named Satoshi Nakamoto kind of brought all of these ideas together in a way that worked. And this was using something called proof of work from Adam Back, digital ledgers by Wei Dai, public key cryptography, to actually lock the coins and everything else. And it came together in this protocol called Bitcoin. And the white paper was released on October 31st, 2008. And if you remember that time, that was right around when the bailouts were starting, when
that's right.
Like there was like $700 billion that had to be injected into the economy in order to save everything from collapse or something like that, the TARP bailouts and all that. And the network went live a few months later, January 3rd, 2009. So it's been 13 years now that it's been going. We just kind of joke that Bitcoin just celebrated its bar mitzvah. But basically that's how long it's been around. And it's longer than the lifespan of Bitcoin itself is this ideal of digital cash, or of this digital currency, exchange of value that can be done without the physical transfer of stuff, which every other form of cash up until this point has been, which is like sending a gold bar somewhere, or exchanging seashells or something like that. So this idea has been around for a long time. And the actual manifestation has been found in Bitcoin, and it's lasted 13 years. It's had the world's largest bug bounty. You can literally make like hundreds of billions of dollars if you knew how to crack it. No one has successfully, because the cryptography in it is so strong. But that's basically what Bitcoin is. It's a digital form of cash, or store of value, or money, as you would call it.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the details of that, but very quickly, let me ask you a fun question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Is Bitcoin considered as a trend, as a business, as a marketing, or as a technology aspect of it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different aspects of Bitcoin, and the deeper down the rabbit hole you go, the more you discover it affects just about everything. And that's partly due to the fact that money is just sort of at the center of almost everything. It's a big part of human relations. I'm a stranger to most people in the world, but I can still do business with them as long as we agree on a money and so on. So if you think about it, money is at sort of like the root of civilization. It's what I would call, as a technologist, the base layer of civilization. And Bitcoin is, in that sense, it is technological in the sense that there is software that's running and so on. But it's much more than that. At least for me, it is money. It is sound money, and it is very important for that reason, because we haven't had sound money for a very long time. The last time anybody was sort of on the gold standard, I think, was Switzerland, and they stopped in the 80s. And before, for most of the rest of the world, it ended in 1971 when Nixon cut ties to gold. So from the US dollar. So basically, essentially, we haven't had sound money in a long time. Bitcoin brings back sound money, and there is a significant innovation from a monetary perspective. A lot of people sort of mistake it as a technological innovation, but actually it's a monetary innovation. And you know, our tendency is to think that technology is the thing that moves it forward. Technology has certainly aided money, but we're really going back to sound money, money that is not controlled by a central entity, that is actually decentralized and can't have its value stolen away through inflation and so on.
Yeah, so the reason why I asked this question, if it is a technology or marketing or anything like that, is because if you take an example of a credit card has a limit balance, let's say of $1,000 with this example. Okay. Now, yes, it's a virtual credit card, but it's a physical thing that you can actually see that, yes, I have $1,000 in my pocket and I can use it whenever I want. Now, this one, you can't see that, you know, if it is going to be 1,000 or 1,000,000 or a couple of grand. So that's why I asked that if this is more of a virtual technology versus anything else. So what are your thoughts on the comparison between the two?
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing out is that this is digital and not physical, and that's the thing. Even a credit card, like a physical credit card, yeah, you can see it, but you know, there are virtual physical cards, and there are things like Venmo and PayPal and things like that, which don't have a physical form, but they are just as useful, right? Because you can transfer value using Venmo or Cash App or whatever, and a lot of these, like, you don't even need to actually carry around the card now. You can store it on your phone or something.
That is true when it comes to PayPal and all, but that is a static amount that you still have. In the Bitcoin world, you don't know what your static amount is going to be like today.
Well, your static amount is it's static if you're accounting in USD. If you're accounting in Bitcoin, you have whatever amount of Bitcoin you have, and that's it. The price of Bitcoin fluctuates to the dollar, and because the world is on the dollar standard, you know, that value fluctuates. But that's a whole separate thing based on like what the rest of society, or what enough people want to sort of like standardize on, and not at all about like something inherent to Bitcoin. It just happens that you know, Bitcoin has some volatility, which is to be expected because it's a fairly young currency, relatively speaking. But you know, like the amount of value is completely fixed in Bitcoin terms, and I would argue more fixed than the US dollar, because as far as the US dollar goes, the supply is kind of unknown. You mentioned credit cards. It's called a credit card because the bank is issuing you credit. And that credit does not come from the savings of other people. The bank just sort of creates that credit ex nihilo, or out of nothing. So the way it works is that say you have $1,000 limit on your credit card. You spend $500 that didn't exist before the bank issued you that credit. So the bank sort of like creates it into existence. And then when you pay off your credit card bill, it sort of contracts the money supplied by that small amount. And that's how all credit works, essentially. It's, you know, the US government borrows this way. This is why they can do something called deficit spending. If you have a budget of $6 trillion and your tax revenues are $5 trillion, the extra trillion comes out of nothing, right? Like they just sort of issue themselves credit through the Federal Reserve and so on. So all of this is sort of to say that the US dollar is very like flexible in terms of supply, which means that in a sense, the amount of dollars you have is constantly in flux with respect to the total amount. with Bitcoin, the supply is known. We know that there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. So because of that, there's this scarcity aspect to it that the US dollar does not have. They continue to issue a lot of money. A lot of what you're seeing in the grocery store with price increases and so on is due to the fact that in the last 2 years, the US government and the Federal Reserve and all of these banks that are part of that whole banking system have essentially created lots and lots of money from thin air, whether it's to support PPP loans or giving out stimmy checks or whatever. All of that money has sort of entered into the economy, and it's made goods and services more expensive. So your dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. So in a sense, your dollar is also fluctuating. It's just not as obvious because it's the prices that adjust rather than the value of the dollar. And your dollar just doesn't go as far. Whereas with Bitcoin, you know exactly the fraction of Bitcoin that you have at any moment. You do not with the dollar. And basically since the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, for the past 119 years, it's been continuously expanding through credit. And it's been a lot of money that's expanded. So in a sense, you're much worse off with the US dollar.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jimmy, for making me explain because there were some few things that I did not know, and it's great that you gave that information. Now, let me ask you this question here, that I have money in my pocket and I deposit into a bank. Now, how does the bank actually work? Is there a different name that I should be looking at? What is a consumer supposed to be looking at?
With a normal bank, how it works, is that what you're asking?
Well, we know how the normal bank works, right?
You might think you do, but it's actually
okay. So then
a lot of people don't.
Okay, so explain that.
Yeah. So a lot of people think here's a normal bank's business model. Okay, they receive deposits from their depositors, say like $10 million, right? Like worth of deposits. And then they loan out and they give the people interest of, say 0.5% or something like that. They loan out the 10 million for 3%, and they pocket the difference, something like that. That's how most people think a bank works. That is not how the bank works. So they will take deposits of 10 million and loan out like $1 billion, right? Like this is how it works. They create money out of thin air. They make another $990 million, and this is what's called fractional reserve banking. So banking is actually when you're depositing at a bank, you're basically giving them a license to print, which every bank essentially is bankrupt in a very strict sense, in that they're not solvent, right? Like if every depositor came in and withdrew their money, then they wouldn't have the funds to cover all of the liabilities that they have. This is why banking makes so much money, because if you're lending out $1 billion at 3%, that's $30 million on $10 million in deposits. You're making like triple the amount of the deposits. And even after you pay out the 0.5%, which is negligible, you actually end up making a serious amount of money, which is why your local bank branch has 47 vice presidents. But essentially that's how the banking system works. A lot of people don't know that they continuously are printing money ex nihilo, and that they are increasing the money supply, basically. As long as they get paid back, they're fine, and the government doesn't bother them too much. But this is how banking at every level works, right? Like not just at the retail level, like your mom and pop bank, but commercial banks, banks probably you haven't heard of, investment banks, and those have like large pools of liquidity and dark pools and things like that, where they can get insane leverage on their money, which is another way of saying they get money printed on their behalf, they leverage it, they make tons of money. But this is how banking works, and people don't understand how banking works because they think, oh, I deposit money, I get back the money, whatever. And the loan part is really where a lot of the sort of shenanigans come in, and honestly, a lot of people don't understand that their money is essentially being stolen from them every time the money increases in supply as a result, because they don't know how it all works, or the supply of the dollar and so on.
So now, so the other point now is that
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the way you explained about the bank and how it works in the background, because I as a consumer, you will never see that and you will never know that till you start discussing and start investigating on that. But does that force me to not open a bank account? Does that force me to just keep the money in under my bed, I guess?
Well, so the thing is, regardless of what you do with your money, the supply of money continues to expand. So whether you keep it in the bank or under your mattress, the supply of money is going to continue increasing, largely because the government likes to spend lots and lots of money that they don't have. This is why the federal deficit continues to increase. So you can think of that as sort of like the amount of money that has been issued as credit to the U.S. government out of nothing, on a continuous basis. It's approaching $30 trillion or something like that. That's how much money that they've spent that they don't have. So there's this constant sort of debasement. So even if you're holding $100 bills, the denominator on the amount of dollars continues to increase sort of unabatedly. So as a result, you end up getting stolen from, even if you're holding money under your mattress. The only way to sort of fix that is to have what we would call sound money. And that term comes from the sound that gold coins make when you fling it up into the air. And this is how people used to be able to tell the purity of the gold inside a coin, was to fling it, and it makes a certain pitch sound depending on the purity of the gold that's in it, and you could tell whether it's fake or not. But with sound money, what ends up happening is that nobody can just sort of increase the supply willy-nilly, and as a result, you have more confidence on the denominator. And this is why gold has been used as money for a very long time. I think over 5,000 years. One of the properties of gold that's very useful, or that makes it sort of an ideal money, is the fact that the entire supply of gold increases at only about 1 or 2% a year. So we have some amount of above ground gold at the moment, and it's measured in hundreds of thousands of tons or something like that. But there's new supply coming in, and that new supply is only 1 or 2% a year. Now there have been periods of history where it's been more than 1 or 2%, but for about 5,000 years, it's been 1 or 2%, which makes it very it makes it a lot sounder, right? Like tomorrow you're not suddenly going to get double the gold supply or something like that. And that's what makes it sound money. It's a lot easier to trust over the long term, because the new supply isn't going to be that much more than the current stock. You do not have that with fiat currency. The US dollar is just one example, but there are lots of currencies all over the world where they will inflate like crazy. So the two most recent sort of hyperinflation stories are from Venezuela and Zimbabwe. I don't know if you've seen $100 trillion Zimbabwean dollar bill, but it exists. And at the time that it was printed, it was worth $1, and now it's worth even less. But basically, this is what happens. When the government controls the money supply, and things sort of get away from them, that they hyperinflate. This has happened over and over and over again, where your money becomes worthless because they just print more of it. We're seeing that a little bit with respect to the US dollar, where consumer prices for a lot of things have gone up tremendously, and they're calling it transitory inflation. But of course, it's not transitory. The price increases kind of stayed, right? If you're going and buying ribeyes at Costco, it's still double the price of what it was even 2 or 3 years ago. So that's what's happening, right? This is what inflation looks like. This is what expansion of the money supply is like. The thing about Bitcoin and gold and other sound money is that you have this assurance that won't happen to you. And that makes it a much better store of value, or a way to save over the long term. And that's what most people, that are in Bitcoin use it for.
Yeah, thank you again, Jimmy. Very quickly, you mentioned the word sound money many times.
Hmm.
What does
Hmm.
sound money mean in a basic way? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so sound money is money that can't be debased very easily. So debasement is an old word, and it comes from the days when money actually used to be metal. So way back in, like, say, biblical times, they used to actually have pieces of metal that you would weigh every day, every time you would do a market transaction. So you would go to the market, you'd want to buy some carrots or something like that. You would weigh some amount of silver usually, and then based on the weight of the silver, you would get the carats. Now that ends up being extremely cumbersome, right? Because if you have to weigh it every single time, you have to make sure that the weights are honest and all this other stuff. Ends up being a very cumbersome and difficult process, and it made transactions much more difficult. Then came sort of like this innovation with coins, and these were this was pioneered by the kings of Lydia. You might recognize some of these names. Midas, Croesus, and Gyges. These were the kings of Lydia, and they were all known for their fabulous wealth. And the reason why they were so wealthy is they created coins that were of standard weight, so you didn't have to go and weigh them every single time that you needed to do a transaction.
Hmm.
And that was great because that brought a lot of innovation, and they were able to charge a premium. They became fabulously wealthy, and you know the story of King Midas having the Midas touch and stuff like that. You know, those are the myths that sort of like grew up around these kings because they were just so fabulously rich from, you know, coinage, from making this sort of market innovation. Now debasement started to enter in as governments sort of took on this role of having standard weights for these metals. The debasement started to come in because they wanted more money, right? And nobody likes explicit taxation, and in fact that's one of the chief ways in which you can be run out of power is by
Next week's episode on Back to Basics.
basement. Is what every government has pretty much engaged in, starting, you know, with I think the Romans, they, you know, they had the denarius, which had like 3.8 grams of gold, and 200 years later, after Diocletian and so on, it came down to basically it didn't have any silver in it at all. From 3.8, so that's called debasement. That process of debasement makes it sort of unsound money, as in it doesn't make that sound anymore because it doesn't make that ting.